got the roster here. I've cleaned this up and simplified it a little bit. I put the date and the email addresses all on one page, so you can look at this on one page at a time and make any updates. The email address is right here on this page. Right. Or on the page where your name shows up. And if your name does not show up, you can add it to the last page. Right at this page. And just
Across the section.
yeah. Okay. Last but not least, Dr. John Miller. We're going to process the item. Thank you. Good to have you back.
Well, you came back. That's a really good sign. Thank you, very affirming. Some of you are new to this, and I have a few copies of the handout from last time. But basically what we talked about in the first go-round is the difficult problem for Christian theology in particular of theodicy, which means the attempt to justify how things are in the world when there is a God who is perfectly good and perfectly powerful. And there is on the back of the handout last time, it was on the second page. The problem of evil is sort of stated very succinctly in a book called God, Power, and Evil, A Process Theodicy by David Ray Griffin from Claremont. And he stated that God is a perfect reality by definition. A perfect reality is an omnipotent being, meaning having all the power. An omnipotent being could unilaterally bring about an actual world without any genuine evil. A perfect reality is a morally perfect being. A morally perfect being would want to bring about an actual world without any genuine evil. If there is any genuine evil in the world, there is no God. And the statement that there is genuine evil in the world leads to the conclusion that there is no God. Now that's tough. That's very tough. And we spend our lives sort of skirting around it, maybe looking at it face to face. I told you last week that in my own family, with my father's illness from polio and being confined to an iron lung, we lived with it every day. Couldn't figure out how in the world this could happen to a good person like this. I said last week that it was like growing up with Job, only unlike Job, he never complained. But this happens to be the 31st anniversary of his death today. And I think of him every day. Little did I know, having done the work on process theology and theodicy in my dissertation with Donald Daw, that 10 years later, after Dad's death, my late wife Margie would die of inflammatory breast cancer. So it was almost, I sort of felt like I lived a life of preparation for dealing with this. And people were always very curious about how I would react to all this. Being an Episcopal clergyman, I was particularly of interest to other clergy. They began looking at me and realizing that what would happen to their vocation if this had happened to them. And I was even at a football game in November after Margie's death, and my son and I were watching football just to have just to get away from dealing with it every day. And I looked about 50 yards away, I saw a clerical collar, and I turned to John and said, "Here he comes." And this guy walked up to me, and he looked at me, and I realized I was feeling a whole lot like a zoo animal. And he said, "How has this affected your faith?
Oh, thank you.
Has this weakened your faith?" And I looked at him, and I said, "Actually, my faith was confirmed in the experience." He had no idea what I was talking about. I did, my son did, but he was looking at a world in which there were basically a binary world. Either you're in good shape or you're in bad shape. If you're in bad shape, that means you can't affirm good things anymore. And that is not true. And those of you who have dealt with very serious trauma or pain or death, or just the various agonies that people go through know what I'm talking about. So we do, as human beings, work through the problem of theodicy all the time. We're trying, especially those of us who are here on a Sunday morning, and having gone through things that you've gone through, you're still here, which is great, which is wonderful. So there's got to be a reason. There's got to be something in you that keeps you coming back for more and a greater experience of good in the church. So what I saw as my job was, as a pastor, was that I address this all the time. There's a whole series, years of sermons, where I would address the issue. And it came to be, sometimes people had had enough of it, and I would get under the table, I get a note saying, I think it may be time for you to move on. One of the things that I would say is that there's no getting over those things. In fact, I didn't want to get over. I wanted to remember everything because of the beauty and the pain all mixed together of the struggle to be alive and to be with one another in a family. So when I did address that in writings, it would come out in the form of some type of theodicy. And the one that I found most satisfying for me was to deal, if you're looking at that logical syllogism, I'm not going to challenge the goodness of God. I saw the goodness of God operative throughout my whole life. I also knew that God was powerful, but this is the question. What kind of power are we talking about? I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the third thing is that I was not willing to just say evil is only apparent. It's an illusion. Just for a show of hands, do you believe that there's genuine evil in the world?
Yes.
Well, over time, most of the theodicies have attacked the genuineness of evil in some way, making it a mystery or something that will be revealed someday, or something that is justified because of human sin and frailty. Or you could go down the list, but basically that's the most popular point on the syllogism to attack and to diminish the reality of evil. Well, one of the things I said last time was that with all of our familiarity with information today, the devices we have, you can get it on your watch now. You can't even, I don't have a watch on, but if you got an Apple Watch or some kind of a device like that, you can get notifications of various terrible things all the time. It's right there. It's right there. So it's not very easy to duck and cover when it comes to the genuineness of evil. We mentioned the Holocaust last time. There's so many different things that have happened. And the question is why, and what is happening, and where is God in all of this? In the literature and scripture, the most famous place is the book of Job. It's a fantastic story, and it forms the background for Rabbi Kushner's study, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Did you read that?
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't, I'd recommend it. It's an amazing piece, and I've heard him speak in person several times. But the story behind Rabbi Kushner's, and notice I said when, not why. When bad things happen to good people, because he's assuming they will. His own occasion was the fact that he learned that his little boy had progeria, which meant an advanced aging process in the child. And by the time his child reached 14, he was a tiny little ancient-looking child. And he died obviously prematurely, and it was an awful agony for him to, the Kushners to endure as long with their son Aaron. And so, he wanted to take violin, so they had a handmade little tiny violin for him to play and so forth. It's an agonizing story to read, but an excellent one. And he began to realize that people were coming to him saying the same kind of worthless platitudes that he had uttered when he went to visit people in their own suffering. And so he decided that he needed to dive into Scripture, in particular the book of Job, to come up with some direction as to what is happening here. So I won't undercut your reading of it, but it is well worth the read. But one of the things he used to say was, in dealing with God's power, is that he says people like to think that someone's driving the bus. And they're willing to forego their own dignity by saying that what they're enduring is not really evil. It's just apparently evil. People like to think that someone's driving the bus. Now, what does that mean to you?
Someone's in charge.
Someone's in charge?
No free will.
No free will,
Invisible hand.
invisible hand. There's so many wonderful things you can say about that. I mean, how is this going on? There are people who are willing, for the sake of the thought of the security of someone driving the bus, that they're willing to forego their own human dignity and just bow before the mystery of evil and just say, I don't know what's happening here, but I throw myself on the mercy of God and so forth. And that works for some people. It just doesn't work for everybody. So the area that I wanted to address was not the goodness of God and not the genuineness of evil, but the kind of power God has. Now, omnipotence as a divine attribute indicates that at least potentially God has all the power. I mentioned last time that one of the free will defenses of God, or free will theodicies, and this is in the Augustinian tradition, is that you could liken, this is my image, liken God to a dealer at a cosmic card game. And God deals a hand to everybody, but God always has the power to pull all the cards back. But in the goodness of God, God gives you a hand to play. So you have a limited amount of freedom to play your hand. If you play it badly, you reap that sadness, and you play it well, you might stave off some problems. But God is responsible because God's in charge. God's driving the bus. God is not indictable because out of the goodness of God, God has dealt you a hand. You see what I'm saying? Well, that didn't work for me. One of the things I wrestled with over the years has to do with the question of free will, and that is the will actually free, or is it only apparently free? Well, I believe it is actually free, and I think that's one of the reasons I had wonderful teachers at Union Seminary, and I could tell that all were dealing with this. And in the Episcopal Church, the English tradition has always been stubbornly free will. There are documents that sound as though they're predestination documents, but unlike the Calvinistic tradition, when Anglicans talked about free will, even in the 17th and 18th century, predestination in the 17th and 18th century, they would just do not double predestination, but single predestination. They didn't like the idea that God would choose some men and angels for salvation and some men and angels for damnation. They didn't like that. They were too polite to say that God would choose people for damnation. So they were, out of that, they would always say that, that there was some level of dignity of human beings in the struggle. So when I looked at the The question is, what kind of power? Omnipotence implies, as I said, that God has potentially a monopoly on power. And if you ask the question, can God do anything? Out of the perfection attributes of God, you could probably say yes. Not everybody agrees on that, but the fact is that one of the reasons why people struggle so much with God's power is they want someone to be in control. And if you're a subscriber to the creation out of nothing theory, then God is not only responsible, but in control of what goes on in the world. And then God can choose to give a limited amount of free will to somebody or some people and not others and so forth. But the fact is that omnipotence implies God's ability to be sovereign over the events that affect us. Is that clear? And this is all about the whole idea of perfection. I mentioned this idea, theism. It is a philosophical idea that there is one perfect entity that is the creator and source of all things. And so when you start describing this God who is the perfect entity, you have all of those lavish descriptions of God's omnicompetence. Everything flows out of that perfection. And omnipotence is one of those things. So what if that isn't the case? What if the obsession with perfection is possibly some kind of need for security, some kind of need for a human sense that somebody's driving the bus, and that we're willing to let that go if we think that God is perfect, a perfect being. I have a question though. Do you believe that your life affects God?
It would have to, because God made all life, so I'm assuming that every life is important to God. That in some way, God has determined your life plays a part in whatever He has in mind.
Okay, well, I agree with you. It doesn't necessarily fit into theism. That's what I'm trying to say, is that I actually agree with you, and I think that from our experience, people matter, and if you and I matter to each other, we are hoping that you and I matter to God. And that's one of the reasons why we pray. One of the reasons why we're doing anything we're doing, we call organized religion. Why do we gather and have these worship services and listen to beautiful music and wonderful sermons and pray the prayers that we do and sing the hymns that we do? It's because we actually, I think, I'm speaking for you, we believe that our worship actually affects God. However, the problem is that a perfect being doesn't need any of that. A perfect being has no need for addition, subtraction, or amendment.
See, that's the problem. We define what perfect is and what powerful is, and I don't know if that's what God defines.
Well, I agree with you. So what if there's a different kind of power that God has, wherein we do matter to God? And I handed out this little piece that I wrote for the Virginia Episcopalian some years ago. It's kind of like the local diocesan newspaper. And in the Virginia Episcopalian, I was asked to write about this whole issue. And I mentioned a person who is going to challenge the notion that perfection means all the power, God having all the power. And he is a very famous fellow, and he wrote a book called The Hardest Part. His name is the Reverend G.A. Studdard Kennedy. It's a hyphenated last name. And he earned his spurs in the trenches of World War I. He was an Anglican chaplain. And so as the piece, you don't have to read it now, but this sort of summarizes a lot about what I'm going to say today. When he reported for duty in World War I, he had not yet seen the trenches and the trench warfare that was going on. He had not been on the front. He had never seen no man's land, never seen the barbed wire, and the mustard gas and the howitzer barrages and all of the things that were happening, machine guns and people slaughtered. But he did decide to sort of ease into the work by going to hospitals and visiting some of the people who were casualties. So this piece begins with his visit to a hospital in France, and he's walking through talking to people, and he's got his brand new uniform on, his brand new clerical collar. He looked like something out of a bandbox, and he walks up to this guy who's lying on a bed, and he's just riddled. I mean, his body has been so insulted by wounds that he's lying there, and he looks at this spectacle of a clergyman, and he looks at him and he asks him the question for him. And that is, he said, "Padre, what I want to know is, what is God like?"
Just an easy question.
And he realized, G.A. Studdard Kennedy did, that he was being asked to give an expert opinion, as clergy often are, about big questions. And this guy's, not only did his well-being, his physical and emotional well-being depend on a good answer, but G.A. Studdard Kennedy realized that his spiritual welfare was on the line. So when he was asking the question, G.A. Studdard Kennedy stood there for a minute, and then he looked up, and on the wall beside the bed was a crucifix. This is my father's. His mother sent it with him into World War II. So things like that I treasure. But he said, "God is like that." And the man's answer is amazing. He comes back and he realizes that the guy shakes his head and he said, "What do you mean? God cannot be like that. God is almighty, maker of heaven and earth, monarch of the world, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, whose will sways all the world. That is a battered, wounded, bleeding figure nailed to a cross and helpless, defeated by the world and broken in all but spirit. That is not God. It is part of God's plan, God's mysterious, repulsive, and apparently perfectly futile plan for saving the world from sin. I cannot understand the plan, and it appears to be a thoroughly bad one because it has not saved the world from sin. It has been an accomplished fact now for nearly 2,000 years, and we have sung hymns about God's victory, and yet the world is full of sin, and now there is this filthy war. I'm sick of this cant. You have not been up there, Padre. You do not know anything about it. I tell you, that cross does not help me a bit. It makes things worse. I admire Jesus of Nazareth. I think he's splendid, as my friends at the front are splendid. Splendid in their courage, patience, unbroken spirit. But I ask you not what Jesus was like, but what God is like. God who willed his death in the agony upon the cross, who apparently wills this wholesale slaughter in this war. Jesus Christ I know and admire, but what is God Almighty like? To me, he is still the unknown God. Wow. I mean, talk about baptism under fire. That young clergyman got a blast from that man's experience. Now, implied in that, and it's more than implied, it's pretty explicit, is that he has been thoroughly schooled in the idea of the remote, perfect, impassible creator of the world. And I use this word, impassible, I think I used it last week. If God is impassive, God is not affected by the world. Impassive. Walled off, remote, alien, distant. And that is the fruit of long centuries of using perfectionistic philosophy to help us understand what the Bible is saying. So Aristotle is in the back of all that. Plato is in the back of all of that. And theologians over the years, they tried to come up with an idea, philosophically, what the big picture looks like. And they came up with the big picture we call theism. And it works. It's a beautifully coherent plan. The problem is that experience flies in the face of it. The man had been schooled in this, and he's clinging to it. But he's angry at this perfect God. God, the remote, the unknown, the walled off, the impassive God, has not only apparently willed his son to the cross, but wills the war to continue. You see where he is? He can't see, even though he went to catechism class when he was a kid for confirmation and learned about the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. There is a wedge in his experience caused by evil that is driven between God the Creator and God the Redeemer, the Son. So Jesus' dying on the cross to him is preposterous. And that's why that article is called The Preposterous Power of God. Preposterous. Do you know the word very well? Poster. Poster has to do with the end. Pre has to do with the beginning. So preposterous means you kind of flipped it over. You've done a reversal. And it's like the caboose coming at where the engine should be. That's what preposterous looks like. So the idea of a suffering God seems completely preposterous to most of the world that buys the idea of theism. So they look at God the Son on the cross and are really kind of, I've noticed, maybe you have too, but I notice how often people separate the two in their talking about God. They'll talk about Jesus and feel very comfortable with Jesus as companion, as teacher, as healer, as friend, and so forth. But when they come to Jesus and try to relate to the creator of the heavens and the earth, there is a divide in there. And this guy is absolutely caught up in the divide, and his faith is about to explode. Because it shouldn't be this way, he says. If God is perfect, this shouldn't be happening. Mustard gas shouldn't be happening. You look at the European continent and how many times it's been fought over. And you look at the modern warfare techniques that were used for the first time in World War I. And you're coming up with a horrendous, flies in the face of everything you've known to be true kind of experience. This happened to theologians themselves during World War I. When the guns of August 1914 rang out and theologians divided over the Kaiser's war plan, there were lots of German theologians who had a whole lot of difficulty with this too. So there were people who rejected and pushed back on this idea of perfectionism, and they abandoned use of philosophical terms to come up with what is God like. And they reverted to biblical patterns alone. This is called neo-orthodoxy, or sometimes neo-reformed theology. The most famous, Karl Barth, he tells a story of being a young pastor and could hear the guns going off in the distance. And he had a vision of himself climbing up a bell tower in the dark. And he was wandering along with the scaffolding going up the top. And he loses his balance in the dark. And he reaches out and grabs hold of the first thing he could grab. And he laid his hands on the bell rope. And as he fell, the great sound of the bell went off. And the bell was the word of God for him. And he said, no more philosophers. It's going to be scripturally driven. That was the basis of one of the first rejections of using philosophy to help theologians do their craft. They went back to the Bible, so to speak. But they went back to the Bible not as fundamentalists. They went back to the Bible as modern people. They had modern assumptions. We'll come back to that in a minute. So Studdard Kennedy went to the front. The man's question ringing in his ears, and all of a sudden he sees all this stuff. Sees terrible things. As a matter of fact, one of my former parishioners at St. Mary's, Phoebe Hoff, was a young woman during World War II, and there were stories about G.A. Studdard Kennedy, and he was known as Woodbine Willie. And a Woodbine is a cigarette, an English cigarette. And what Woodbine Willie would do as a chaplain is he'd go along, his uniform would be loaded, he's not carrying a weapon, but he was carrying lots of cigarettes. And he was distributing cigarettes to people in the trenches. And people began to have great affection for him because he was relating directly to the soldiers. He wasn't some distant, remote figure. He wasn't some austere guy who had all the answers. He was in the mud. He was in the muck of the trenches, and that's why he gained credibility. And while he was in the trenches, he revised his whole idea of God's power. He knew something was wrong. The young man on the bed in the hospital had pointed it out to him, and he had taken on the project of figuring what is God like then. And what he began to see little by little in the trenches is that God is affected. God does relate in a social way to us as we relate to each other socially. And so the idea of this perfectionism he had to reject altogether. Here's another passage, because the perfectionists wanted to clothe Jesus like this too. Any of the great statues of the sculptures of Jesus, or things that make him look like a royal, in the finery and the baubles and the gold and all this stuff, he too, said G.A. Studdard Kennedy, is a victim of this perfectionist kind of obsession. He said, in the hardest part, he said, Christ is clothed in that omnipotence which has been all down the ages, the veil that hid the real glory of the suffering God of love. But the cross remained. It made its mark, and men could not forget. It is, of course, God's real throne, the throne of love that lifts him up and draws all men to him at last. The power of the cross is the power of God. It is not past, but ever present. God has no other and needs no other glory than the glory of the cross, the glory of suffering, striving, and unconquerable love. This glorified Christ in regal robes is a degraded Christ reft of real majesty. These baubles are not worthy of the King. The true God is naked, bloody, wounded, and crowned with thorns, tortured but triumphant in his love. He is God, and when men's eyes once see him, they must worship him. He possesses them body and soul and will never let them go. He is coming to his own today. The furnaces of this war are burning out the dross of dead conventions from the Christian creed and showing up the pure gold of the cross. That's revolutionary talk. And he's writing this in England after the war, where the English and the Allies were triumphant and the Germans vanquished. But he is really continuing the war by publishing these essays which form the part of his book, The Hardest Part. So for him, the clarification of the view of God is that God is not driving the bus. God is in the bus. God is not making the world into trench warfare. God is in the muck of the trenches. God is not above and removed from suffering. God is suffering, dying, bleeding. If you're familiar with Elie Wiesel's book Night, there's a famous scene in there that Elie meant one way and some Christians have taken to be another, and we can do that. Christians are good at appropriating things. The scene is that there was there were 3 people accused of a crime within the concentration camp, 2 grown men and a boy. And they are all going to be executed in front of the rest of the camp. So they all were assembled to watch the execution, which is by hanging. And so the 2 grown men who were heavy, right at the beginning of their concentration camp time, died quickly when they kicked the stand from underneath. They died very quickly. But the boy took several hours to die. And so they all stood there in the sun with their caps removed, watching this child die. And somebody cried out in the crowd, "Where is God? Where is God now?" And Elie Wiesel said, "I heard a voice come up within me and say, He is there on the gallows." Now, for him, that meant the death of God. For the Christian interpreters who wrote the foreword to the book, Night, they took this to mean, what scene were they seeing? The crucifixion of Christ with the 2 thieves and Jesus in the middle. And he is there on the gallows. On the gallows is a way to talk about suffering love. And later, actually, that idea came back to Elie Wiesel. But at the time, it caused his rejection of the whole thing, the whole enterprise. He was out. Cashed in his chips, he was no longer a believer. But when people have read this, they see the power of suffering love there. I commend it to you. I'll never forget reading Night for the first time, and I had the radio on in the background. It was when the Union Seminary owned the public radio station, and I was a faithful listener. So someone put on, just at random, as I'm reading this scene, someone had put on Fiddler on the Roof in the background. Today, I can still feel the chills that I got when I thought, my gosh, this is a convergence of ideas that are extremely powerful. So, suffering love is what G.A. Studdard Kennedy saw in the trenches, and he came to the conclusion that human beings are not by nature that good when they try to help each other out in the trenches. By nature, human beings, he said, are going to try to survive. They've got to live for the next day. But things kept happening. People would run out and pull a guy from the barbed wire and be shot at and maybe killed in the rescue attempt. People would do anything for their brothers in the trenches. And he began to realize that the cause of all this wasn't humaneness or philanthropy or some by nature goodness of humanity, but it was emanating from another source. And for him, he made the intuitive leap. It was coming right from the cross. That for him, that was the key that unlocked the whole mystery of what the power of God is. Love is a power that cannot be conquered. It just keeps going. It keeps replicating itself. It keeps developing. It keeps reaching out and trying to help other people in the worst of circumstances. And for him, that is the model. The model of God's, if you want to call it perfect power, is the perfect power of love. Think of the most wonderful passage in the New Testament describing the nature of love. Do you know what I'm talking about? If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. You go through the whole list of what love is, and Paul ends it by saying, so faith, hope, love, abide, these 3. But the greatest of these is love. That's not just something you read at a wedding. This is one of the most brilliant, inspired pieces of writing in the New Testament for me. In fact, at St. Catherine's School, where there's a monument to my late wife, I was told I could design it. So there's a kneeling girl with her hands outstretched like this, and They have 4 benches, and I had to decide what to put on the benches. It should be inscribed. And so, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And on her tombstone, I put, love never ends. So that's the power that Studdard Kennedy ascribed to the power of God. And that is the idea that this is it. It's not the ability to coerce. It's not the ability to make things come out right. It's not the cosmic cavalry coming in to save you at the nick of time. It's not the deus ex machina, you know, the idea that God dropping in from above to save the drama from collapse. This is from the ground up. This is where God is. God is here. God is with us. God is now. And that is what we're experiencing when we experience the compassion of other people. It's coming from a source. It's not just derived from ourselves. But with us together, multiplying that compassion, we can do amazing things. So, Studdard Kennedy made the intuitive leap between the cross, a symbol, and the nature of God. The problem is that he had really good intuition, but like the neo-Orthodox theologians like Karl Barth and so forth, the language still lacks specificity. The language of the Bible, the story of the symbols of the Bible, need something, need a framework, need a lens through which human experience can be interpreted so we can see how that fits with it. And for a number of theologians, starting in the 1960s, they heard the clarion call to this from a man named Langdon Gilkey, who is a theologian who was in Chicago, and he wrote as a young postdoctoral student, he wrote a bombshell of an essay called Cosmology, Ontology, and the Travail of Biblical Language. And basically what he was doing was saying, my colleagues, my modern thinking colleagues in the New Orthodox movement can say things like, and God parted the sea, and the children of Israel passed through. But if you ask them, what do you mean, God parted the sea? Do you mean that actually like Cecil B. DeMille, that they kind of like Jell-O, they pass through that? Is that the way it worked? Or they said, well, you know, there was a strong northeast wind that blew the sea back. I actually saw that in the Outer Banks. There was such a strong wind that the what was it called? Behind the Outer Banks is
The sound.
the sound. Thank you. I woke up to go get a cup of coffee and a newspaper, and boats were sitting on mud out there. It was all gone. It blew the sound out to sea. And so if they said there was a strong northeast wind that parted the waters when the Hebrews came through, the question that Gilkey says is, what's the difference between that and a meteorological event? How is that an act of God? And they didn't have an answer. That's the problem. They all sort of hoped you would understand. I remember growing up in a church with several eloquent pastors who do beautiful sermons. And they would say things, but I knew I was supposed to get it because they were using symbols, like the burning bush. I'll never forget that one. The burning bush. I went, okay, I get what he's trying to say there, but how does that work in the actual world? Well, what has happened is that some younger theologians in the 60s, they're not young anymore, began to look for a new philosopher to help come up with the big picture. And that is my springboard next week to talk to you about process theology and the work of Alfred North Whitehead. Because that's what he did. He came up with a set of ideas that are inextricably relevant to everything that happens in the world. That's a pretty big thing, if you think about it. But he was trying to come up with a metaphysic, that is, a set of principles that govern the world. And I picked up on that and began to realize this is a way to talk about the suffering love of God, because they're talking about the same thing. So I'm going to park it there. And
About 10 minutes for
do you have
questions or
some
follow-up.
questions or follow-up? I hope that wasn't overwhelming. Yes.
What is the difference between theism and deism?
That's a good question. Deism is a variant of theism. It's a rationalistic philosophy that basically got really popular in the 18th century. And the idea was that God, a perfect God, did create the world and its wonderful systems, but basically, in a kind of metaphorical way, kind of backed away from the world. It's sometimes called the watchmaker theory, where God would put together this brilliant plan, wind it up, and then back off and does not intervene. You remember the movie Oh God? George Burns? Every time George Burns would come on the TV, my son, who was then in his youth, would say, "Daddy, God's on TV." That movie was basically a deistic movie, because God wasn't doing anything. It's all up to you, he kept saying. He kept sending messengers. It's up to you. You've got to do this. But he wasn't going to change anything. Yes?
John, just an interesting thing about Langdon Gilkey that kind of fits what you've been talking about. I had Langdon Gilkey at Ohio State University a long time ago, after he had written his book Shantung Compound.
Oh, yes.
If you're familiar with that.
Love that book.
But, you know, a lot of what he has to say comes out of his own experience. And of course, he was in the same prisoner of war camp in China that Eric Liddell was in, and knew Liddell, and had sort of tied a lot of his thinking to these experiences of suffering.
That's a great book, Shantung Compound by Langdon Gilkey. Maker of Heaven and Earth is another one of his books. He had a bunch of books and was a wonderful spokesman. He was an American Baptist, meaning a northern tier states Baptist. Yes?
I enjoyed your article, but I didn't understand one thing, if you could explain it. It's your sentence, while self-emptying compassion remains the decisive disclosure of God's type of power.
Yes. In Philippians 2 passage from Paul, and Donald Dahl wrote a book about it, as a matter of fact. Self-emptying is kenosis, that is, that Christ did not count equality of God a thing to be grasped, but instead emptied himself, poured himself out. You get an image of a chalice of wine, pouring oneself out for the world. That is the self-emptying love. That is the selfless act. You know, there are lots and lots of anecdotes about this, but one of them from my own high school class was a guy, if there was ever a fist fight in the schoolyard, he was always one of the two guys who was fighting. And he was a kind of angry young guy, and he decided he was going to take his anger and put it into constructive ways, and he enlisted in the Marines, went to Vietnam. He was one of the first casualties in Vietnam. He threw himself on a hand grenade to save his fellow soldiers. Now, what led that guy to do that? What does happen when people do things like that? And that's for Studdard Kennedy, that was a clue that something else is happening here than is apparent. Did that answer?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. One more?
No, go ahead.
All right. No, seriously.
We still have 5 minutes.
Yeah, it helped me a little bit, and I think I heard this, but in the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil.
Mm-hmm.
And if I listen to what you're saying, it wasn't protect us from evil.
Yeah.
It was deliver us through resurrection.
Yes, that's correct.
Is that right?
I don't think God is in the protection business. We've certainly used the language of protection a lot in the church over the ages. But if you just take a look around, I mean, Amy last week in her sermon mentioned the Lisbon earthquake.
Yeah.
And I sort of flew past it, but it was virtually all the Christians in Lisbon were in the church, when the cathedral, when it collapsed on them, and they all died.
Yeah.
Now, deliver us from evil doesn't mean, hold the walls up, or don't let the roof cave in. Deliver us from evil, for me, has to do with transformation of the experience into something good. And I can say that that's what I've experienced of the love of God. It was when I consider the things that I have actually attended, that I've been at deathbeds of so many people, and it's amazing the power of what happens. And I just think that there is something else that is helping us transform something that looks like a catastrophe into something better. I have a colleague, a friend, named Michael Farley, who is the CEO of Elk Hill Farm, which is a place used to be for young men only, but now it's young men and young women to try to turn their life around out in Goochland County. The late Buford Scott was one of the founders of Elk Hill Farm, as was my St. Mary's pastor, Holt Souter. Michael went to Kenya to be in the Peace Corps right after he graduated from college, and he lived in a mud hut for 2 years, and he helped people with agricultural projects, but was so affected by the people and their love, their ingenuity, their appreciation, that he's gone back every year at least twice, and he's now about to retire. He founded a program called the Makindu Children's Program for children who are orphaned by AIDS. So a terrible epidemic of AIDS in East Africa. The children left behind could have just died, but something good came out of that. There was a redemption project to bring those kids into a secure, safe place where they have food, clothing, and education, and are being raised to be good, upstanding citizens. That's what I say.
There was a chapel service at Westminster Seminary was going for three weeks. And the title of it is What God Can or Can't Do, or What He Won't Do. So I'm sure it won't answer any questions, but it seems like it might assess them.
Everybody has an opinion about these things. One of the things I've told Deborah is that unlike most professions, everybody has religious assumptions. And I wouldn't think to walk up to a physician and say, I've been thinking about my medical problem. I think you ought to try this. Unlike what the TV ads say. But in theology, everybody's a theologian in some way or another. Everybody thinks about God, either rejecting or not sure about or embracing somewhere along the line. But so I don't know what the outcome of that set of sermons was, but I hope it was affirming.
I don't know what it will be, but it will.
It's coming up.
It's coming up.
This is the one you were telling me about. Jim Hall. He's a philosopher.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, it's time. Thank you for your patience.